The gunshot wasn't what stopped the ruthless head of the Costa family. It was a lullaby. Amidst the chaos of a crowded plaza, a woman knelt, whispering a rare, forgotten Sicilian dialect to a terrified boy. Watching from the shadows, the untouchable boss froze, whispering a single command: "Find her." The crystal chandeliers of the Pierre Hotel fractured the evening light, casting prisms across the grand ballroom. It was a charity gala for pediatric research, an event that drew New York's elite, the politicians, the Wall Street wolves, and the men who owned them both. Sienna Hayes stood near the velvet-draped arches of the eastern exit, smoothing the skirt of her understated navy dress. As a freelance interpreter and event coordinator, she was invisible by design. Her job was to facilitate, to translate the murmured conversations of international donors, and to ensure the champagne never stopped flowing. She preferred the periphery. The shadows were safe. The spotlight was dangerous. Across the room, the atmosphere shifted. It was subtle at first, a ripple in the water. Men in tailored tuxedos subtly adjusted their jackets. Security personnel touched their earpieces with a synchronized, rigid tension. Sienna's instincts, honed by a past she had spent 10 years trying to bury, flared to life. The air grew suddenly heavy. Alessandro Costa had arrived. He did not walk into a room. He consumed it. Alessandro was the head of the Costa Syndicate, a legitimate billionaire on paper, and the undisputed king of the East Coast underworld in reality. He possessed a dark, arresting features, sharp jawline, cold obsidian eyes, and an aura of absolute, terrifying authority. Flanked by his right-hand man, Gabriel Russo, and a phalanx of silent security, Alessandro moved through the crowd. The sea of socialites parted for him, offering nervous smiles and deferential nods. Sienna turned her face away, pretending to inspect a floral arrangement. She knew the rule of survival in a room with a predator. Never make eye contact. Then, the unthinkable happened. It started with a muffled crack near the cloakroom, followed by a sudden, jarring crash of breaking glass. Someone screamed. In an instant, the veneer of high society shattered. Panic is a contagious disease, and it swept through the ballroom in seconds. Guests stampeded toward the exits, abandoning their composure. Tables were overturned, sending crystal flutes shattering onto the marble floor. Sienna was pushed against a pillar, struggling to keep her footing as the tide of terrified elites rushed past her. The security alarms began to blare, a deafening, rhythmic wail. As the crowd thinned, she saw him. A little boy, no older than 5, trapped in the center of the chaos. He had been separated from his nanny, his small hands covering his ears as he sobbed hysterically, entirely overwhelmed by the noise and the trampling adults. A heavy velvet curtain was tearing loose from its brass rod above the boy, threatened by the crushing weight of the panicked crowd pushing against it. Without thinking, Sienna broke her own rule. She moved out of the shadows. Darting through the fleeing guests, she threw herself over the child just as the heavy brass rod and velvet crashed down, shielding his small body with her own. The impact bruised her shoulder, but she ignored the sharp sting. She pulled the trembling boy into her arms, dragging him to the safety of a fortified stone alcove near the kitchen service doors. The boy was hyperventilating, his chest heaving as tears streamed down his face. He was in full panic, his eyes wide and unseeing. Hey, look at me," Sienna said in English, her voice steady and warm. "You're safe. I've got you." The boy didn't seem to hear her. He babbled frantically in Italian. "Dov'è il mio papà? Ho paura! Lasciami!" Sienna realized with a jolt that he was speaking a very specific, old-world dialect. It wasn't the standard Roman or Milanese Italian taught in universities. It was the guttural, lyrical cadence of the Palermo elite. the very dialect Sienna had been forbidden to speak since she was 12 years old. She took a breath, letting the ironclad walls she had built around her past crack just a fraction. She cupped the boy's tear-stained face, brushing his dark curls from his forehead. "Calmate, pichiridu," Sienna whispered, her voice dropping into a soft, hypnotic rhythm. "Ulupunun tipigya, chisugnu yuka." "Calm down, little one. The wolf won't get you. I am here." The boy blinked, his sobs hitching in his throat. The familiar cadence of his homeland acted like an anchor. Sienna continued, leaning her forehead against his, humming a deeply obscure Sicilian lullaby, a song about the silver moon over the Tyrrhenian Sea. "Dormi figlio di la luna, l'umare è calmo, la notte ti è scura." She spoke the words with flawless, native precision. The harsh consonants and rolling vowels flowed from her lips naturally, carrying a profound, sorrowful, maternal warmth. The boy's breathing slowed. His small hands gripped the fabric of her dress, and he buried his face in her neck, finally exhaling a long, shuddering breath. 30 feet away, standing in the shadowy corridor of the VIP mezzanine, Alessandro Costa stood entirely frozen. The chaos of the ballroom was still raging, but for Alessandro, the world had gone completely silent. His men had formed a protective ring around him, their weapons drawn, scanning for the source of the initial disturbance. But Alessandro's obsidian eyes were locked onto the woman in the navy dress, kneeling in the alcove. He couldn't see her face, only the dark cascade of her hair and the elegant curve of her back as she shielded his associate's son. But he heard her. Even over the blaring alarms, the acoustics of the marble hall carried her voice straight to him. "Dormi, figlio di la luna." A cold shockwave violently tore through Alessandro's chest. The air left his lungs. His hands, usually steady as stone, twitched. That song, that exact dialect. It wasn't just Sicilian. It was the ancestral dialect of the Falco bloodline, a Mafia dynasty completely eradicated 20 years ago. The only person Alessandro had ever heard sing that specific arrangement, with that exact inflection, was his own mother. Mere hours before, she was brutally murdered in a crossfire when he was just a boy. It was a guarded, intimate piece of his past, a ghost long thought dead. No ordinary woman in New York City knew that song. No ordinary woman possessed that accent. The boy's father, a minor capo loyal to Alessandro, rushed through the clearing smoke, falling to his knees beside Sienna to gather his child. Sienna smiled softly, stood up, and slipped backward into the shadows of the service hallway, vanishing before the father could even ask her name. "Boss?" Gabriel's rough voice broke through Alessandro's trance. "The threat is neutralized. It was a drunken altercation in the lobby, a misfire. NYPD is en route. We need to move." Alessandro didn't look at Gabriel. His gaze remained anchored on the empty space where the woman had just been. The phantom echo of the lullaby still rang in his ears, unearthing a violent, tempestuous storm of memories and adrenaline. He felt a dangerous, predatory obsession taking root in his mind. "The woman in the blue dress," Alessandro commanded, his voice a low, lethal rasp that sent a shiver down Gabriel's spine. "The one who protected the boy." Gabriel frowned, looking toward the alcove. "I saw her. She slipped out the back." Alessandro finally turned to his second-in-command. His eyes were entirely black, stripped of all humanity, burning with a terrifying intensity. "Find her, Gabriel," Alessandro ordered. "Find everything about her. Where she sleeps, who she speaks to, what she breathes. I want her entire life on my desk by morning." The interior of the Costa Enterprises boardroom was a testament to modern power. Floor-to-ceiling soundproof glass overlooking the Manhattan skyline, polished mahogany, and an atmosphere of sterile intimidation. It was 3 a.m., but the city below was still alive. Alessandro stood by the window, a tumbler of amber bourbon untouched in his hand. He hadn't blinked in what felt like hours. The melody of the lullaby was a relentless loop in his mind. The heavy mahogany doors opened, and Gabriel stepped in, dropping a thin manila folder onto the massive conference table. The fact that the folder was so thin was the first red flag. "You're not going to like this, boss," Gabriel said, taking a seat and loosening his tie. Alessandro turned, his expression unreadable. He walked to the table and flipped the folder open. A small, blurry surveillance photo from the hotel's security footage stared back at him. It was her. Even in the grainy resolution, he could see the sharp, intelligent angles of her face, the tense line of her shoulders. "Sienna Hayes," Gabriel began, reading from his notes. 30 years old. Works as a freelance high-tier translator and event coordinator. Speaks fluent Italian, French, Spanish, and Arabic. Graduated top of her class from Columbia University with a degree in linguistics. Currently lives in a modest, secure apartment in Brooklyn. Pays her taxes, has zero criminal record, no outstanding debts. She's a ghost in the system, completely ordinary. Alessandro stared at the paper. No one is completely ordinary. That's exactly the problem, Gabriel replied, leaning forward, his eyes narrowing. She's too ordinary. I had our hackers dig into her financials, her childhood, her medical records. Do you know what they found? Alessandro looked up. Tell me. Nothing before the year 2008, Gabriel said, his tone dropping into a serious register. Sienna Hayes didn't exist until 16 years ago. Her social security number was issued when she was 14. The birth certificate from an Oregon hospital? A masterclass forgery. The childhood school records? Backdated and inserted into the system by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Whoever scrubbed her past had federal-level clearance or cartel-level money. Alessandro's grip on his glass tightened until his knuckles turned white. A forged identity. A 14-year-old girl appearing out of nowhere. A woman who instinctively shields a child from gunfire and speaks the dead language of the Falco Syndicate. She is hiding, Alessandro murmured, a dark smirk playing on his lips. And she chose my city to hide in. Boss, if she's a plant from the feds, or worse, a spy for the Moretti family, Gabriel warned. She's not a fed, Alessandro interrupted. He walked back to the window. Feds don't speak the Palermo underworld dialect, and the Morettis aren't cultured enough to train an operative to that level of perfection. She's something else. Something older. Alessandro closed the folder, his decision made. He wasn't going to send his men to interrogate her. A woman who had survived by hiding in plain sight for 16 years would bolt at the first sign of a tailored suit at her door. He needed to trap her in a web so subtle she wouldn't realize she was caught until it was too late. Contact her agency, Alessandro ordered. Tell them Costa Enterprises requires a highly specialized translator for an upcoming acquisition involving Sicilian delegates. Tell them we specifically request Sienna Hayes due to her background. Double her standard rate. Triple it if they hesitate. Gabriel nodded slowly. And if she refuses? Alessandro's eyes darkened. Make sure she understands that declining a direct request from Costa Enterprises would be incredibly detrimental to her agency's future. 2 days later, the trap was sprung. Sienna stood in the opulent foyer of the Costa estate in Long Island. The sheer scale of the mansion was staggering, a fortress disguised as architectural brilliance. Despite her outward calm, her heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. When the agency told her who had requested her, her first instinct had been to pack her go-bag and disappear. She had spent a decade and a half staying out of the crosshairs of men like Alessandro Costa, but running suddenly, right after the hotel incident, would confirm whatever suspicions they had. She had to play the part of the oblivious civilian. She had to be Sienna Hayes. Ms. Hayes. A deep, resonant voice echoed through the grand hall. Sienna turned. Alessandro Costa was descending the sweeping marble staircase. In the daylight, he was even more intimidating. He wore a bespoke charcoal suit without a tie, the collar of his crisp white shirt unbuttoned. He moved with the silent, predatory grace of a panther, his dark eyes entirely fixed on her. "Mr. Costa," Sienna replied, keeping her voice even, professional. She forced herself to meet his gaze, ignoring the sudden, heavy tension that seemed to suck the oxygen out of the room. "Thank you for the opportunity." Alessandro reached the bottom of the stairs and stopped just a fraction too close to her. He invaded her personal space deliberately, testing her boundaries. Sienna forced herself not to step back. "The pleasure is mine," Alessandro said smoothly. He gestured toward a set of heavy oak doors. "My study. We have much to discuss regarding the upcoming negotiations." Sienna followed him into a cavernous room lined with thousands of leather-bound books, smelling of rich tobacco and old paper. She immediately noticed the tactical layout of the room. Heavy bulletproof glass on the windows, no blind spots, 2 exits. She catalogued it instantly, an old habit she couldn't break. "Drink?" Alessandro offered, walking over to a crystal decanter. "No, thank you. I prefer to keep a clear head while reviewing contracts," Sienna answered, taking a seat in a high-backed leather chair. Alessandro poured himself a measure, watching her reflection in the glass of the liquor cabinet. "Your file says you are quite exceptional with dialects, Ms. Hayes, particularly Italian." Sienna's stomach tightened. "I have an affinity for languages. It serves my clients well." Alessandro turned around, leaning against the mahogany desk, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. He watched her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. Language is a fascinating thing. It can build bridges. It can also act as a fingerprint, an undeniable proof of where a person comes from. Sienna kept her face, a carefully constructed mask of polite interest. Indeed. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. Then, without breaking eye contact, Alessandro spoke. He didn't speak in English. He didn't speak in standard Italian. He spoke in the raw, guttural Sicilian dialect of the old families, the exact dialect she had used to soothe the boy. "Ti sia mucciata buono, mau passato, non mori mai." You have hidden well, but the past never dies. Sienna's breath caught in her throat. It was a micro-expression, a slight widening of the eyes, a fraction of a second where her meticulously constructed facade cracked. But for a predator like Alessandro, a fraction of a second was all he needed. She quickly recovered, tilting her head with a perfectly feigned look of polite confusion. "I'm sorry, Mr. Costa. I recognize that as a southern Italian dialect, but it's heavily localized. Are those the delegates we will be speaking with?" Alessandro didn't smile, but a dark, terrifying amusement danced in his eyes. He set his glass down on the desk with a sharp clack. "You are very good, Sienna," he murmured, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper as he pushed off the desk and began to slowly walk toward her. The fake background, the perfect civilian posture, the confusion in your eyes right now. It is a masterpiece. Sienna stood up, her instincts screaming at her to fight or flee. "I don't know what you're talking about. If you are unsatisfied with my qualifications, I can leave." She took a step toward the door. In a blur of motion, Alessandro was there, blocking her path. His hand shot out, not to strike her, but to gently, firmly grip her wrist. The touch was electric, a sudden clash of heat and suppressed violence. "You aren't going anywhere," Alessandro said, his face mere inches from hers. He could feel her pulse racing under his thumb. It was beating wildly, but she wasn't trembling. She was preparing for combat. You knew the song of the Falco bloodline, a family that was butchered 20 years ago, a family whose surviving members were hunted to extinction. Sienna stared up at him, her heart pounding, but a fierce, defiant fire finally ignited in her eyes, burning away the Sienna Hayes persona. "Let go of my wrist, Mr. Costa," she warned, her voice dropping its polite pitch, revealing something dark and razor-sharp underneath. Alessandro's eyes flared with twisted fascination. He leaned in closer, his lips brushing against her ear. "Tell me your real name," he breathed, "before I have to tear this city apart to find it." The air in the study was suffocating. Alessandro's breath was hot against Sienna's ear, his grip on her wrist like an iron manacle. It wasn't just physical force, it was the absolute, crushing weight of his presence. Sienna looked at him. Really looked at him. The Sienna Hayes facade crumbled completely, revealing the wolf that had been living inside the sheep. Her spine straightened, her shoulders went rigid, and her gaze became a weapon, cold, calculated, and devoid of fear. With a sudden, explosive burst of leverage, she used her free hand to strike a pressure point on his bicep. The sudden shock forced his grip to loosen for a fraction of a second. It was all the time she needed. She didn't run, she counterattacked. She dropped low, sweeping her leg to knock him off balance. Alessandro, expecting a flight response, was caught off guard by the combat maneuver. He stumbled back, and she followed through, closing the distance, her hand forming a lethal ridge aimed at his trachea. He reacted instinctively, catching her strike just millimeters from his throat. They were locked in a stalemate, their faces inches apart, breathing hard. He was significantly stronger, but she was faster, and used his own momentum against him with terrifying efficiency. A slow, dark grin spread across Alessandro's face. It was the first truly human expression she had seen from him, and it was terrifying. It was the expression of a hunter who had just realized his prey possessed fangs. "No, you are definitely not a Fed," Alessandro murmured, easily keeping her pinned, though she fought like a trapped lioness. "They train them for compliance. You were trained for assassination." "Let go!" Sienna hissed, abandonment of all pretense. The oak doors to the study burst open. Gabriel and two other armed men rushed in, weapons drawn. "Boss!" Gabriel shouted. "Don't move," Alessandro commanded his men, without taking his eyes off her. He let go of her hands and stepped back, smoothing the front of his jacket. The aggression evaporated, replaced by a devastating coolness. "She is a guest, Gabriel, though I find myself questioning her choice of pleasantries." Sienna didn't flee. She stood her ground, her body a coiled spring. Alessandro looked at her. The Falco family was eliminated by a rival faction from Napoli, the Morettis. They were thorough. They didn't just kill the capo, they salted the earth. They killed the women, the children, the cousins. They wanted the bloodline extinct. But you knew the dialect. You knew the lullaby. There are only two options. He began to pace around her. Option 1. You were a distant relative who was away at school and slipped through the cracks. Option 2. He stopped directly in front of her. You are Francesca Falco, the Don's youngest daughter, the one they allegedly found dead and burned beyond recognition in the nursery. Sienna stayed silent. Silence was her armor. Silence had kept her alive for 20 years. "They found a body," Sienna finally said, her voice dropping into a register Alessandro had never heard from a woman. It was a dead, cold, emotionless monotone. "They found a body. They never confirmed it was yours," Alessandro countered. "But I know. That lullaby was never written down. It was passed from mother to daughter. My mother was a Falco before she married my father. She was your aunt, Francesca." The truth hit her like a physical blow. She knew the dialect was a blood link, but she had assumed he was merely familiar with the geography. The realization that they shared blood, however distant, was horrifying. "You are Costa," she said, spitting the name like it was poison. "I am the man holding your life in my hands," Alessandro said softly. He gestured to Gabriel. He found the discrepancies. He found the blank spaces. "Now that I know you are Falco blood, I cannot simply let you go. If you are alive, other enemies might seek to use you. The Morettis might come searching again." "No one knows I'm alive," Sienna insisted. "I know," Alessandro said. He walked back to his desk and pulled out a fresh sheet of paper. "I can wipe your digital footprint. I can make Sienna Hayes truly vanish. I can give you the protection that only this name can provide." He looked up at her, a strange obsession burning in his obsidian eyes. It wasn't just a political problem for him. She was a link to a mother he had lost, to a culture he was forced to keep hidden. She was a ghost he wanted to keep. "But in exchange," Alessandro continued, his voice low and possessive, "you will work for me. Not as a translator, as my eyes, my ears, a phantom I can unleash when traditional methods fail. You are a weapon, Francesca, and you belong to me now." Sienna felt the trap snap shut around her. She had escaped one cage only to walk willingly into another, but she looked at the arsenal of weapons aimed at her by his security detail. She knew about Gabriel Russo's reputation. She looked into Alessandro's cold, intense eyes and saw a man who would tear the city apart, exactly as he promised, to possess her. She had spent 16 years running. She had nothing left. Sienna stood tall, squaring her shoulders. She met Alessandro's gaze, her fire matching his own. "I have 2 conditions, Alessandro," she said, using his first name for the first time, establishing a sliver of leverage. "Conditions?" Gabriel scoffed. Alessandro held up a hand. "I'm listening. First, the boy from the hotel. If the Morettis were looking for him, you ensure his safety, permanently. The dialect is rare. If they are looking for it, they will find him." Alessandro nodded slowly. "Done." "Second," Sienna continued, her voice gaining a hard, dangerous edge. "When I work for you, I am not a toy. I am not something you parade around to intimidate others. You treat me as an equal force, or I will vanish so effectively you'll think I was a mass hallucination." Alessandro stared at her for a long moment. He had never had anyone negotiate with him like this, especially a woman. The sheer audacity of it fascinated him. He walked back to her, stepping into her space once more, but this time he didn't grab her. He reached out and brushed a stray lock of dark hair from her forehead with a surprising, almost tender touch. "We have a deal, cousin," Alessandro said softly. For 6 unbroken months, the civilian known as Sienna Hayes ceased to exist. In her place, Francesca Falco became the Costa Syndicate's most lethal, invisible asset. Working alongside Gabriel Russo, she bypassed brute force, dismantling rival operations through encrypted wiretaps, blackmail, and surgical precision. But her most dangerous game was with Alessandro himself. Bound by the eradicated Falco bloodline and the heavy silence of the Costa estate, their professional boundary blurred into a dark, consuming obsession. He gave her unfettered access to his empire. She gave him the only unfiltered honesty he had ever known. Their fragile equilibrium shattered on a torrential October night at a Costa-owned shipping terminal in Red Hook. Sienna was monitoring the estate's security feeds when the port's encrypted grid abruptly flatlined. It wasn't a glitch. It was a coordinated blackout. Armed with twin Kimber 1911s, she sped into the storm. The yard was a chaotic war zone of driving rain and muzzle flashes. She found Alessandro pinned behind a rusted freight container, bleeding heavily from a gunshot wound to the thigh. Standing triumphantly in the downpour, flanked by heavily armed mercenaries, was Lorenzo Moretti, the Napoli boss who had slaughtered her family 2 decades prior. "I should have burned that nursery to ash," Lorenzo mocked over the thunder, raising his weapon toward Alessandro. Sienna didn't freeze. She embraced the monster she had spent a lifetime hiding from. Sprinting from the shadows, she bypassed her firearms entirely, hurling a tactical combat blade with terrifying velocity. It buried itself in the throat of Lorenzo's closest guard. As the man fell, the yard erupted into a deafening crossfire. Sienna threw her body over Alessandro, returning fire with ruthless accuracy to keep the Moretti men pinned until Gabriel's heavily armored extraction team finally breached the terminal gates. Bleeding and outgunned, Lorenzo vanished into the labyrinth of shipping crates. Hours later, sitting in the sterile light of Alessandro's private clinic, Sienna refused the morphine. The searing pain in her grazed shoulder was a necessary anchor. Alessandro limped into the room, his obsidian eyes locked onto hers, instantly recognizing the terrifying shift in her posture. Sienna stood, closing the distance between them. She reached up, her bruised fingers fiercely gripping his jaw. "I am no longer just your spy," she whispered in the raw Palermo dialect, her voice a promise of absolute ruin. "Give me your men, Alessandro. We are going to burn Lorenzo's empire to the ground." The lullaby was over. A war had begun. The Mafia boss, obsessed with a ghost from his past, had unchained a survivor who knew the deepest secrets of the Palermo dialect. In trying to possess her, Alessandro Costa had handed Francesca Falco the keys to an empire. Together, bound by blood, secrets, and a dark, twisted love, they were no longer just running. They were hunting, and the city would burn until they found their peace.